de la famille.
Hello everyone. I'm super happy to be here tonight to talk about equity for employee with three super guests, with the main stakeholders of a startup company, a founder, an employee, and a VC. But first, I have a few questions for you. Who is an employee? Okay, thank you. Who is a founder? Most of you. Okay. Who is an investor? VC, business angel? Yes, know you. And who is a millionaire? Not yet. Not yet. Bonnie Brown was an employee. And Bonnie Brown sold her stock options for about $5 million. And the most exciting about this story is that Bonnie Brown turned a multimillionaire by massaging underneath back at Google, of course. Here you go. No? Here? Yeah. Here, she is. You don't know Bonnie Brown? And by massaging underneath back, she turned, thanks to her stock options, a multimillionaire. That's the best case scenario. Of course, she was working at Google. But most of the time, your stock options worth nothing. Why? Because giving the numbers of startups that failed. But the main points about stock options are work, loyalty, and luck, just like Bonnie Brown. But regardless your position in a startup, stock options will remain a complex matter. Why? Why? Because stock options are at the crossroads of three different matters. First, finance. Second, legal. And third, HR. HR because stock options are used to attract, motivate, and reward people. But it will remain a complex matter, and here is a visual sum up of the stock options journey. So you will need to understand when you work with people and when you want to incentivize people with stock options, all the terms that are in this graph, like strike price, capital gain, cliff, vesting schedule, exit, how that works. So we gave you a glossary with all the terms and the graph to explain that, but then how to make that really simple to understand. Believe me, it's a headache. It's a headache, but tonight we're here with three super guests to make it easier to understand. When I was a legal counsel at La Roche-Kidioui, I was confronted to the pain and hassle to implement stock options and to make it understandable to people, and at the end they didn't understand anything. Why? Because it wasn't really simple. It was just technical words to them. And that's why we discussed with the family afterward, and we decided to create Ekwity. Ekwity is a company that aims to make startup ownership real. I just asked you if you were a millionaire, but that depends on you. That depends on the project you're working for, and luck. But making startup ownership real is just about telling people what they get and what you give when you're a founder. And to demystify the subject, that's why we are here tonight with this beautiful panel, with a founder, with a VC, and an employee, just to have their real insight about the topic. We are super happy, though, to welcome the VC, Dominique Jackson, Head of Talent at Dex Ventures, the founder, Rodolphe Ardan, CEO and co-founder of Spendesk, and the employee, Florian Jourda, first engineer at Boxed. So give them a big round of applause and welcome them on stage. Hello, guys. Thank
Hello.
you very much for being here tonight to speak about our subject, employee equity. First, before we start our discussion, just could you introduce yourself in few words, tell us your personal story, and why you've been involved in employee equity. So, who want to start? Florian, maybe?
Yes. Hello everyone. So, is it working? No. Salut tout le monde, ça marche? Ouais, c'est bon, ça marche. Hello, so I'm Florian. I spent 10 years in San Francisco, and I worked for Startup Box. I joined as a first engineer when we were 7. I stayed 8 years, and I saw the company double in size each year until we were like 12 or 1300, and went public in New York. So I saw many things about the growth of a startup and how much equity we got at the beginning, equity when we got bigger and stronger and stuff. And I moved back to France 3 years ago. I work notably at the family, and I help CEOs and CTOs scale their organizations on people and execution topics.
Hi, I'm Dominic Jackerson. So I'm Director of Talent at Index Ventures. I'm based in London. So Index is a multi-stage leading VC across Europe and the US. And my role there, I've been there for 6 years now, is I work across our portfolio with founders and exec teams on any issues to do with talent, which obviously might be recruiting, but one of the recurring themes and topics which always comes up is around compensation and equity. And I've done a lot of research on that, and last year we published a lot of that research in the form of a book and a web app. Actually, I left the book in my bag, so I can't wave it, but called Rewarding Talent. So it's a comprehensive, like 150-page playbook for European entrepreneurs thinking about implementing stock option plans. So there's that work I did, and then there's this web app called Option Plan, which allows you to design your equity allocations across your whole team. So done a lot of work on this, and have been great working with Florian more recently as well, Equity in the family, in helping to sort of spread that philosophy of the importance of equity. In terms of what I did before, operating roles. So I'm not an investor. I sit next to the investment team, but I've worked in scaling organizations as a chief operating officer twice over, from like 0 to 400 people. Okay.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Rodolphe. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Spendesk. Spendesk, we've got a very simple mission to explain. We want to free people from all the hassle of payment at work. The company is 2 years old. We're 50 people working at Spendesk. We are backed with great VC, with Index. Yeah, my background, I'm an engineer. I started my career building a first startup that got acquired by a local group. Then I joined another startup as an employee, which was Drivey, and restart the stories building Spendesk 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you very much. So the main question, probably you wonder, all of you, is why we give equity to employee. Why we just want to compensate people with equity instead of cash? What is the point of like incentivize your team with stock options instead of cash or whatever? Maybe to begin, Dominic?
Okay, all right, I'll start. I think four key reasons why you reward employees with equity. One is hiring, so attracting talent and hiring people. 2, and I'll come back to these, 2 is about retaining people. 3 is motivating people. And the 4th is getting alignment across your team. So in hiring, as Florent just indicated, you're a startup, you don't have the cash, you can't pay the same cash salaries for great talent that they could get elsewhere in more mature companies. So it's really risk capital to allow them to see upside and allow you to sort of pay less in terms of salary and protect your cash flow. Retention, it's about thinking forward. When you're successful and you're you're growing, you're gonna your people, your employees are going to be top targets for other companies to poach from. So you want to create a moat to protect against your employees leaving. Motivationally, if everybody, it stems from that. If you've got a stake in a company that becomes worth a lot, it's a disincentive for leaving, and it keeps you focused on the goal at hand. And the alignment piece is really if everybody in your team has a piece of the company, you've got that core overarching focus across everybody about thinking about the success of the company in the long term.
Rodolphe, I'm really curious about your insights. Does it really work, these alignments of like incentives? This incentive, does it really work with the interest, the alignments of interest?
Yeah, for me, it's. The main reason is really a cultural thing. At Spendesk, we really want to build a company where ownership is a key value. So we want to build a company where everyone can feel they are founders of the company themselves. We want people to be entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs must have balls in the game and think as entrepreneur. So for me, it was an evidence that I really wanted to ensure that every people that join the company has these balls in the game. This was the first thing. And when people start thinking on that, why I get equity on the company is not only that I'm interested in it and the financial, but I'm also have an impact on what I'm doing, and I'm interested on the global results of the company. And you start having people not thinking about their own egos, but just clearly about the end goal of why the company is here.
Okay, thank you. Florian, do you see many differences between US and Europe with the stock options? And like people are maybe more used to this kind of incentive in US rather than in France. What do you think about that?
So first, things are changing pretty fast. Like 2 years ago, startups here in Paris will be pretty bad and not generous about giving equity. Now the best and most ambitious startups understand how critical it is, and they allocate way bigger stock option pools for the employees, and that's great. So it's going in the good direction, but generosity is still not there. Maybe we could be like twice as much generous in Europe as in the US. That's the first thing. And the second thing is education about stock option is very bad here. Even in the US.
Why that?
Just because it's not really in our culture. I don't know. I don't know if we should do like some political history of France, but so. Like travail contre capital. But it's people are not educated about this on multiple things. First, how it works, on the taxations, on really how much you can make, and in the US people are more aware of this. And I see many startups where people have actually some great deal of equity, some employees, and they don't realize this, and they want a raise in salary, but it's very neglectable compared to what they have in stock options. So it's always weird to me to see this difference.
Okay, Dominique, on this point, maybe with the comparison between US and Europe, because you've been working with Index Venture in both. So what do you think about that?
Well, in terms of the quantifying that, I mean, Florian, is exactly the research which we've conducted comparing ownership of startups between the US and Europe. It's almost exactly what you said. Pretty much for a later stage startup in the US, about 20 to 25% will be owned by employees, either as equity or stock options. In Europe, the average is about 10%, and it varies an awful lot more, the variability in Europe compared to the US. And why? I mean, I think the biggest factor, it's the chicken and egg that investors in Europe often are too wary about diluting the ownership, and sometimes founders as well. And they say, why should I dilute when employees aren't demanding equity? It's like, if I can hire somebody without giving equity, why should I? So you have this chicken and egg problem. And the biggest motivator for employees to demand equity is when they see big exits. And the vast majority of big exits in startup world have been obviously in the US. So employees in the US are much more likely to have either made money from stock options or know somebody else in their network who has made a significant amount of money from stock options, like Bonnie. And then they're saying, hey, I'm interested. I want to do this. So we're just further back in that journey. But that is changing. And as you see more big exits in Europe, that increased interest in stock options and equity therefore increases. So yeah, I think that's the key thing. It follows, it's a cycle, the maturity of the ecosystem.
Right. And Rodolphe, you said that it's really important to incentivize your team with stock options, but what do you think about everybody should receive stock options? In Spendesk, for instance, can you give us some example how it works?
Yeah, so as I said, for us it's really a cultural thing. So everyone at Spendesk have board in the game and have access to equity. What's interesting is that sometimes when you're hiring people are not so interested into equity. So we give sometimes a choice between, they want a high salary or making the choice between salary and equity, and we've got people that prefer salary at that time, which I totally understand, because sometimes, I don't know, you've got an apartment loans or something, you've got charge and you cannot accept to have a drop in your salary, right? However, even for this person, they've got a small amount of equity, because we really want, if we are to build a company of owners, again, you cannot feel an owner of the company if you don't have at least something in it.
Okay. And you said that when you have interview with people, you talk about cash rather than stock options, and I'm pretty curious to have your insight, Florian. When you do an interview, what to discuss about equity, what the conditions are really important to discuss. What was your experience at Box?
My experience, I don't know if it's very relevant, because the founders of Box were 19 years old. I was 23. They had never managed anyone. It was really freestyle. But I just negotiated for the sake of negotiating. They gave me like 0.3%, and I said, no, I want 0.5, and they gave me 0.4. It's like just stupid. But it was still pretty generous, I would say, like for the beginning. Then in the negotiation process is something that you can do only at the end. It's like a salary, because you don't want to be like too picky before really making sure it's a mutual crush, of course. But actually, I found some excellent HR people who check this from the beginning, that just the price range and the equity range will be okay before people lose too much time. It's something that you can improve as well in your process.
And Dominic, what do you think? You have founders here who are spending a lot of time to hire people, and it's really difficult in a high competitive market. And what to discuss, how to incentivize, how to attract people with stock options when you have an interview, and what to discuss. What will be your recommendation on that?
During the interview, what to discuss? I think it very much depends on the stage. I think you've probably got a mixture here, and a majority of founders, I would guess, where you haven't got significant investment capital yet. So you're really bootstrapping, or you're on relatively limited amounts of money. So then you're having to offer equity as a significant alternative to cash salary. You won't be able to pay anything like the same cash salary that some individuals could get elsewhere. So that is a sort of different type of conversation to, if you have got some investment capital, you can pay a reasonable salary, and then the equity is a sweetener on top of the cash salary. So you've got those two different scenarios. But I think exactly as Florian said, I'd say you introduce the discussion about equity as if it was part of the remuneration. So you might try and flag it up early on to make sure it's not a deal breaker and you don't waste time, but otherwise it comes in later in the conversation when you start to think about tabling an offer for the individual. And then when you table that offer as salary and equity, you need to reflecting what we said about the low level of education of people in about stock options in Europe, you really need to spend the time to explain what the equity means. You don't want to oversell it, but you are selling the dream as well. So you need to explain, make absolutely clear there's zero risk or liability to the employee in stock options. You're not asking them to put money on the line or to risk. There's no chance of them having a tax bill if it doesn't work out. You have to explain some basics like that. And then you are just explaining how, without getting too technical, but you explain how if the company succeeds in the way you want it to, the sort of quantum of money.
On that point, Rodolphe, what do you do when you ask people, and how do you explain that during an interview? What's your questions usually people ask, and how it works?
I think it's much easier now that we've got evaluation, VC money, etc. That's but kind of standard between cash and equity, so you can make a correlation. The difficulty is really in the early stage. I mean, you've got nothing. You've got people joining your dream, your adventure, joining you at that time where you just need to convince them that you're going to build something huge, where there is no value, quantitative value of the equity. So why can I get 0.2%? Why not 1%? Why not 5%, etc.? So that's a very hard conversation to have, because it's all about future, and there is no rationale about that. So you try to get some standards of what if a good employee ramp up joining you in the early stage and the company grows, if they ramp up, what should they have eventually? But still, that's the very hard decision. So at the moment, it's very easy for me. I've got a really allocation plan depending of the levels of the person, of the role of the person is taking at the company, etc. And so we've got this equivalent cash and equity at the company. But in the early days, it was more a question of passion and trying to discuss of something fair on the adventure together.
Okay. And Florian, do you have any recommendations to employees here tonight to bargain when they do an interview? What will be the main condition to discuss first? Okay, we understand like maybe the percentage, but maybe the cliff, the vesting period, are there the conditions you have to discuss during an interview? But it means that you need to understand first what does it mean, sure. But what will be your recommendation?
So I think generally the best practice that you want is to have compensation as fair and transparent as possible. So when you join a startup, you want to make sure you have a compensation that is fair for you but fair for other people. And you don't want to negotiate more because you're a good negotiator. So what I like is startups where they have a very clear process to tell, okay, at this level, you have this level of equity. And that is awesome if you can get this. So you can pick those startups. For example, startups like Alan have made this like very explicit. Or
Buffer in US.
Yeah, exactly. Or a front app as well. They have a great little simulation tools that you can understand like how much equity we will make. That is awesome. Just a side note on this, you can have like a formula to what equity you will give, but you have to be still flexible, like Rodolphe said, to give more salary or more stock depending on what people prefer. If you're too rigid, it's pretty stupid. So first, you want to make sure that happens, and then you can ask also what is the current equity split in the company. How many shares are there, and really like the shares you give me, like what percentage does it correspond? If people don't want to give you the total number of shares, it's a very bad sign. It means like you will never be fairly compensated. Yeah, I think I will ask those questions. But then it's really the number of shares. The strike price, which means like the price you will have to pay for those shares, is fixed. You cannot negotiate this. The vesting schedule as well is usually the same. On 4 years, you get it like month by month, except the first year you get nothing until 1 year. That you should not negotiate, but it should be like this. You should make sure it's fair.
Okay, thank you. Really interesting. And what do you think, Dominic, about that? The main point to discuss. It's pretty much the same, like the number of shares, and how do you communicate when you're a founder? What will be your recommendation to speak about cash or percentage? What will be the most important step?
Yeah. I'm wondering if you're a brother from another mother, because the things you're saying are almost exactly what the words I would use. But I usually say at later stage, it's better to present a equity offer to people as a cash amount equivalent. Generally, just because when you're valued at 50 million, 100 million, 200 million, then almost any if you translate almost any employee other than the executive into ownership level, saying, hey, congratulations, you've owned 0.02% of the business, doesn't sound very exciting. But if in cash terms that is 20,000 euros or 40,000 euros, that's a meaningful amount. And you can say, if we grow the valuation 10x, that's several €100,000. So that's at later stage. Early stage, almost definitely employees, I feel like you should be honest with them about the ownership level as well. And you can be, because it's a meaningful ownership amount. So I think I'd present it in that way.
Okay, and another question is, who decides to implement a stock option plan? Is that the founder, the VC? Who decide and the conditions in that plan?
For me, the VC asks you to have room for your employees. So when you make your fundraising, they will have you make sure that you've got a stock option plan ready for your employees, okay? For your future hires, for your existing employees, etc. But they don't tell you how to allocate it. This is clearly on the founders, right? On our side, we decided between the founders what was the culture of the company, what we wanted to build, and how we wanted to compensate employees and people joining us in this adventure, making sure they feel they are part of this. So that's the design of the plan was made by the founders. Basically that's.
Okay. What do you think, Dominic? Like VC usually has to have a pool when they do a fundraising and reserve that pool to employee. And why that?
Why do VCs have a pool? I mean, VCs will be in favor to a greater or lesser extent, but they'll all be in favor of allocating, of carving out for a pool for employees, because if you're a good VC, you know that human capital is every bit as important as financial capital to building a successful business, and therefore the talent is critical, and you need to reward that talent. So if you're a smart investor, you realize that having that equity pool might dilute your ownership and the founder's ownership a certain amount to make room for employees. But it's about the size, building a big business where it's the size of the cake which matters much more than your particular, if you own 6% or 4% or whatever, is much less important than building a business which could be worth 10x more, because you get the right team in place that can build you and be world class and build a fantastically successful business.
And what the average percentage you reserve to the pool between different fundraising?
I mean, the sort of standard model or the most common model is a 10% pool at seed stage. And then it starts to diverge, it diverges quite a lot between Europe and the US. So the standard model in Europe has been the sort of de facto model, which we're really trying to challenge, has been the pool dilutes with each round afterwards. So you do your Series A, the seed pool dilutes from 10% to maybe 8% or 7.5%. You top it back up to 10%. Then it dilutes again at Series B and you top it back up. So it always stays at this sort of 10%. The US model is standard would be from 10% at seed to 15% at A, and then it creeps up towards 20-25%, like I said later. And we thought of advocating in our methodology an approach which is somewhere in between. We're saying the demand from talent isn't so high that you have to follow Silicon Valley just like a religion, but it's something in between, because now interest in equity is greater in employees in Europe, and European entrepreneurs are more ambitious to build truly world-class companies. So we have to reward our people in line with that.
Okay, do you agree with Rodolphe that the condition in the plan depends on the founder rather than on VC, and VC that they like ask the founders or maybe recommend some conditions to implement that in the plan, like the vesting schedule, the cliff, or how much do you give to these kind of people? Well,
we've tried to, in the research which we've published, it's very, very explicit, like guidelines and very clear recommendations. It's always, the company is owned by the founder, or the founders, so it's absolutely their decision ultimately at the end of the day. But there are certain things which speak to the philosophy of the founders, and if they don't follow certain things, it's a bit of a red flag. Not things like vesting schedules or whatever, or we generally say on things like that, just follow a standard model. You're trying to innovate and disrupt a business sector, not disrupting the way that stock options vest. So don't bother trying to do that. But we would say a red flag would be for us things like if the founder wants to have a much smaller pool allocated for employees. That's a red flag. Like, hang on, that suggests you're either greedy or your ambition isn't high enough for the company. Or another red flag, one that we're sort of pushing on a lot is actually how you treat leavers, right? So when employees leave the company, the selfish or the short-term interest of the investors should be, well, you leave the company, you lose everything. But we'd sort of say, look, take the long-term view that if you do that, you're going to have employees will leave. And if they're leaving and they feel pissed off because they've put all these 7-day weeks and working really hard for you for several years, and they end up with nothing, they're going to be really bad-mouthing you. Your reputation will be hurt in the market. You'll find it harder to hire new people. So things like that, we will coach and advise, but ultimately, we can't.
That's what great VC thing. But usually, the standard is when you leave the company, you only have 90 days to exercise, and this is pretty short. And we've seen in US a 10 years period, because the validity of the stock option usually are 10 years, and some of companies, US companies mainly, implement conditions like that. And what do you think about that? Maybe Rodolphe, about interesting and letting employee to exercise within 10 years after they leave?
That's a very good question. I would say that you want, as a founder, you want to give you the possibility to extend that on case by case. The standard is 3 months. I mean, when you've got a leave on your company, someone is a very good leave. That's okay. The employees has another opportunity and made exactly the good job, etc. But sometimes it could be a bad leave. So you're in conflict for a reason, etc. And as a founder, you need to protect you on having someone to stay long term in the capital, which is a bad person for the company in the end. So you need to be protective in the rules that you need to have on your leavers, but you can always extend this period. So that's my philosophy on that.
Case by case.
Exactly. On the case by case, there is very good leave, and the person has not the money to exercise, etc. I mean, I don't care. I will extend this period. It's fair. We are in very good terms, etc. But if you're in conflict with someone who is trashing the company for any reason, I mean, you want to make something which is where you still have the reins to control that.
Okay. At Box, what were the conditions in your plan? Do you remember if you had 3 months or maybe more to exercise, or maybe the other conditions? The vesting schedule was pretty standard. And what were the conditions in that plan at Box?
Yeah. So we'll have the standard vesting schedule of a cliff of 1 year, and then you get everything for every month for 4 years. And so if you stay 2 years, you have half of the stock options you were promised. Okay, pretty easy. And then when you leave, you have 3 months to exercise. Who is familiar with what we're talking about here? Okay, like not really. Okay.
You should take maybe the glossary when we speak to get the terms, but we try to make me more
So
understand.
what happens here? So imagine I go to Box and I get 1,000 share stock options at 10 cents per share. Fine, and then a few years later I leave, and now the value is $5 instead of 10 cents. I have the right to buy those shares, and when I leave the company, I have 3 months to pay those shares, and I pay at the strike price of 10 cents. So if it's 1,000 shares, it will be just $100. Very easy, like no problem. But sometimes actually it's tough, because if I join Box in the middle of Box when we are 500, then the strike price is not 10 cents, it's maybe 6, and when I leave it's at 12. So then I have to pay 6 times 1,000. So it's a lot of money. And it's very difficult. And sometimes, actually, I find the system is not very fair, because you have to take a big financial decisions. You have actually to be good at finance and at investing to understand, should I pay or not? And sometimes
And
you
who have to pay? You and
you have to pay with your own money to acquire
your
the
own money.
shares.
Okay.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to borrow money for this. And even the worst is that you have to pay taxes on this in the US on shares that you cannot sell, and it's actually a very big problem. I don't know how we can fix this. First thing to do is to educate employees about how it works with different scenarios. What happens if you leave bad or good? When the valuation is at that much? How much money do you have to give right now? What are the taxes you will pay? I really hope we could answer those questions. And it's pretty easy. You just ask all your employees what questions they have about stock. You ask a consultant to answer those questions, and you give it. In the US, people will never do it, because they don't like to have liability, and no one wants to give advice about finance or legal stuff. But it sucks. Honestly, be nice with your employees and try to explain as much as you can about how things work.
Okay, that's really interesting. That, but Dominic, what do you think about that? Like when you leave, why the VC do not buy back the shares? Why they don't allow people, if it's a good leave, of course, if it's a bad leave, it's just a case by case scenario, just as you said, Rodolphe. But in that case, why VC doesn't allow people to cash out and to get the money?
I think a couple of things there, and I just want to make sure we don't get too technical as well. So, bearing in mind it is a technical topic. I mean, look, just to frame it, sort of said why levers is important. Partly because there's a group of you in the audience who are saying, you're here as potential employees or employees in startups. So for you, this is personally very important, because if you join a startup early, the journey for Box or an average startup now to get to IPO is like 10, 11 years. And not many employees who are joined very early. My research on this says of the first 20 employees in a startup, if you end up IPOing, only 4 or 5 of those 20 will still be working at the company. So levers is really important to you if you're an employee. And for entrepreneurs, it's really important, as I said, because if you have people leaving feeling pissed off or as if they've been treated badly, your talent brand will be damaged in the market and you'll find it hard to hire. That's why it's important. In terms of answering your question, I think I'm really in favor later on, if a startup is very successful and there is a lot of demand from investors that they want to buy shares, you can start to structure a sort of program where investors might be able to buy shares from people leaving to avoid the sorts of problems or minimize the sort of problems that Florian mentioned. But that's much later in the journey. It's much less likely to happen early on. In terms of that balance, because I sort of talked to you, the balancing part of this equation, though, is that you also, you've got to strike a balance. You don't want to make it so easy for employees to leave that really there's no disincentive. The point is that stock options are critical for retaining people. And if people can leave, keep all the benefits, they don't have to put any cash up front in order to become a shareholder, and they can leave, go work with another company, they're still benefiting from all the work that the rest of the team is doing to build the value of the company, even though they're not there. And that doesn't feel very fair either. So you have to strike a balance, and the strike price is trying to do that. But I'd just say, it varies a lot from country to country. A lot of this is tax policy and regulations.
And how the strike price is set, and what is the strike price? The strike price is the price you have to pay when you want to exercise and buy your shares. So the case is mainly when you leave the company, because when you stay in the company, you don't have to exercise your shares. You just like vest and earn all of your options. But how it is fixed? It depends on the different countries, regulations.
The strike price differs a lot. I've done a review of 22 different countries across Europe to say how all of these different things, it's all in the book actually, so which I mentioned. But actually France is actually very, very good. Amongst Europe, France is in the top tier of the treatment from a tax point of view and regulatory point of view. The BSPCE scheme, as well as like the free shares and everything, but particularly BSPCE is a fantastic scheme. So you're really...
Why that?
It's a great scheme, basically because employees only have to pay tax at the point that they sell the shares. In a lot of countries, including even the US in some cases.
So only when they get the money, they have to pay tax.
Exactly.
Okay.
So otherwise, if employees have to pay tax maybe years before they'll actually see any cash from the stock options.
That was the point.
That's a really big decision. It's like, do I pay money up front for tax for something which might be worth nothing? It's a big decision. Whereas in France, also like the UK, there's a couple of countries in Europe, only a few, where you only pay tax when you see the money. So then you just net off, you make this much money, then you pay some tax, which is totally fair. But so that's a big thing. And that also the strike price is the other one that you said. That's one of the things where the French system isn't so good, that the strike price that you are forced to pretty much require employees to pay is reflexive of the value of the company from what the investors have paid. Pretty much.
This is the fair market value of the company?
We're going to get too technical, I think, if we go too far down that.
Yeah.
But in the US, for instance, you can offer your stock options to employees at a big discount to what the current market value of the shares are, which means that when employees want to exercise those stock options, they don't have to pay that much money. In France, you would generally have to pay it doesn't matter when you're starting out and you're seed funded or whatever, your valuation is so low that the strike price will be low. But when you become a bigger company, as in the example that Florian said, when your share price is high, it makes a big difference that in like the UK or the US, you can offer the shares for such a low amount of money that it's very attractive to employees.
Okay, that's what you get.
I hope that. I don't want to get too technical, but it's worth like reading a bit more if you're thinking about implementing a plan.
Because you only get money, and this is a capital gain. It's the difference between the strike price and the selling price. So that's what you said. It's only interesting when the company have a bigger valuation when you sell your shares. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. And do you get only stock options, Rodolphe, when you get hired in a company, or do you have like different dynamic plan? And what do you think? Because the point, as Dominic said, is to retain people and to motivate people like for a long time. When you have an exit, it takes 11 years, maybe 7 years. It depends. But what do you think about that? Do you only get
so again, what do you want to scheme? Or do you want to motivate and compensate people for the progression they go in your company and the impact they have? So you need to start designing also a performance plan. People are going to grow with your company. They're going to take larger responsibility, etc. So they're going to be promoted in your job. And clearly your stock option plan for these people should match your global compensation plan. So for instance, at Spendesk, we started to structure that, saying we've got different levels of impact at the company. For each level, there is an allocation when you enter the company. When you get promoted, there is a difference so you should have more stocks allocated compared to the new position you have. Then there is a refresher on your total stock option.
A refresher is that you get more stock options?
Yeah, you've got more stock option because you get promoted. And if we are to hire someone in your position, that would be the allocation this person should have. So clearly, it's fair that you get the same allocation.
And you have a difference between the strike price when you have the refreshers, the new stocks, and between the stocks you had.
Yeah, that can happen also. That can happen that during this, when you're promoted, the company had a new funding valuation, so the strike price got higher, but on the new grants you get, it's the new strike price.
So it means that the new grants are like less interesting than the first ones, but it's because of the risk you take. So maybe it's fair because of that, because it was riskier when you joined the company when the company was not mature.
That's why it's always, in terms of opportunity, joining the company in the early stage is much more interesting than joining in the later stage.
Okay, and maybe from sure.
So at Box, I stayed 8 years, which is very long. So after 4 years, I got a refresher, and I at 6, etc. Also, when I started to get better and be promoted, I got some extra stock. But at the end, it was small compared to what I got at the beginning. Maybe half or a third of what I got initially. So then you don't think in terms of, as Dominic said before, at the beginning you think in terms of percentage. Oh, cool, I have 0.1% of the company. Later you really think about equivalent in cash and say, okay, my salary is 100K, but I'm actually vesting with this new grant 50K or 100K per year, and that's great. So you really think differently.
Okay. And how do you communicate that in the company? How do you speak about stock option? You said that it's really important to have a fair and transparent policy, but how does that work in the company and in France and maybe compare? Okay, Rodolphe.
On that, we are very transparent on our compensation framework, on our equity framework with people. We're still working on it at the moment, but as soon as it's totally ready, we totally communicate in how it works transparently, because you need people to understand why they get allocated this amount of shares and not more and not less. So if you're not transparent on that, that's going to be very complicated for them to understand, okay, why I have got this and the person working next to me got that. Transparency, again, it's part of our culture, and that's something, so we communicate very transparently with them on that.
Okay. And Dominic, what do you think about that? Do you have to be fully transparent?
It's very strange, and I know I've said this, I think, to you in the past, Flora. Transparency seems to be something which is very, very fashionable in Paris, in the Paris ecosystem, more than any other ecosystem that I've worked in, right? I think I would make a distinction between consistency and transparency. So transparency is a choice. You may choose to be transparent about, like buffer, exactly, saying this is all our salaries, and you put it all out there. That is very, very unusual, and I'm still trying to figure out the psyche and history in France why it's very popular here. It's not very Anglo-Saxon, but in terms of consistency is the critical thing. I would say to founders, no matter how transparent you are, you have to think, if you were challenged by an employee, why did that person there get this much and I only got this much, that you would be able to give an answer that you are proud of rather than lying, right? And the reason consistency is so critical in my mind is because as founders, the equity in your company is the most precious asset you have, right? And you are giving that equity to people in order to bring them on the journey with you and to keep them really highly motivated. If you give people in your team that precious asset, and yet they feel pissed off or that they haven't been treated fairly, it was totally pointless. You've just diluted your ownership for no purpose. So I'm always, it's one thing, okay, in terms of like a takeaway, if you're a founder from this, be consistent, because otherwise you could have a pool of 10%, 20% given to employees, but they'll end up feeling they can't trust you, they're pissed off at you. It totally hasn't worked. So just be absolutely ruthlessly consistent.
And how was the communication in Box when you joined the company? If there were like any transparency or consistency about the compensation with stock options? How did that work?
We were really noobs. I think even the founders really didn't understand how it worked. So the communication was very bad. Even when we grew, it was still pretty bad. We started to be very good at communication when we approached the IPO, because then you have to be to fix so many internal processes and to communicate extremely about what it means to have an IPO, what it means for the stock, for a lot of things like this. So it came very, very late. But that is not the best practice at all. You can do way better than this. And actually, I have one dream to fix a lot of this. And maybe you can fix this with your startup. I think we need to have a new... Yeah, what?
Hopefully, yes.
So I will tell you what to do.
Yes, we'll work together on that.
So we need a new contract for Ekwity, something that is in one page, no legalese, so no legal wording, something extremely simple, with simple lines that explains in different situations what will happen, so that like my mom can understand stock option grants. And that will actually solve a lot of the problems. So if you can fix this,
that's true.
That would be awesome and a new standard.
The point is to make really simple to understand, because nobody read the legal paper. Maybe Dominique, do you read the legal paper, the stock options, the VC, about the communication? Is there many companies that do workshop
communication to employees?
Or this?
I mean, I do sometimes get involved in it, but it's not usually a thing. Communicating to employees is not something VCs are generally well known for being world class at. So, I mean, I've been involved a few times in helping to launch a plan, but usually the perspective that I would bring is why are the investors excited about this, and why are we excited about the company? So you're being given a slice of the company, and we think this company is on a really exciting journey. So to give that independent validation, it's not just the founder with the Kool-Aid story. It's actually, we have put millions of dollars into this business as well, because we believe it could be something special. So it reinforces the message from the founder.
Because when you have to speak about stock options, you also have to speak about finance of the company, the valuation. It's maybe a really sensible information. So that's why maybe VC don't really want founders to speak with the employee about the valuation of the company, to be too transparent on these numbers, maybe about disclosure.
It varies a lot. It varies a lot, and it varies a lot by the stage of the company, and where it's a lot of different factors there. So I don't think we have a black and white view all the time on that. I would reinforce you want to make, I think you give the information, there's a difference between the information that you give up front, and you want to make it as digestible and simple. Think of it like for your customer journeys, UX and onboarding. It's the same idea with the stock options. You want to make it as simple as possible, but you can't go into too much detail, right? There's a certain level of detail you go in, and then you say, if individuals have more questions, come and ask us. So I wouldn't go into all the details. You have things like, the preference shares versus ordinary share structures and all these different things. It's way too complicated. I get confused sometimes with it. It's like, you need proper mathematical models. So you will lose people. And again, the whole point you're giving stock options is to motivate people and keep them feeling excited. If you get too technical about it, it's like the health and safety warning on cigarettes or something. It becomes a negative. So just keep it simple, but offer to people, if you want to know more, we're willing to answer your questions.
And Rodolphe, how do you communicate about stock options and avoid any confusions between stock options and salary? Because usually people say, okay, you give me stock options, it's part of my compensation package, So, okay, but how do you avoid this confusion with salary? What should I get, stock option and not cash? If I have the choice, should I just get stock options or should I get cash instead?
Yeah, we try to be very clear on what stock options are. We work together on publishing a note to communicate to employees exactly how BSPCE works, how the taxation of BSPCE works, when to exercise, not exercise, etc. So they can into it to understand what they get clearly. Then you've got all the, when you allocate your grant, there is a lot of paperwork to do, and you need your employees to follow up on the value of the grant they have, and you've got SaaS solution that start emerging to do that. For instance, I know that eFounders is launching a new product, which is Ekwity, that we start testing to allowing employees to see what they get and also to gather all the paperwork they've got on that. That helps them also to understand and follow up depending on the different rounds you get on. Okay, that's the increase I got on my stock. But again, equity is not cash. It's only cash when there is liquidity.
And when? That's the last question we have. And
Good
that's
transition.
a good transition. But yeah, how we can turn stock options into cash? That's the main point. Do you?
Yeah, for me, there is really liquidity events happen when the company gets acquired.
Just liquidity events
Means you can transform you can sell your share to someone else, basically. When can you sell your share to someone else on the market, etc. So if someone else buys your company, everyone is selling their shares to this acquirer, right? Second thing is, let's say you want to go public on the market, so you want to say my shares can be traded publicly by people. Everyone can buy some shares of my company. That means that your employees, yourself, your investor can sell their shares to people. That's when you've got, for instance, an IPO. That's the main liquidity events that the company can have. Okay. Sometimes there is a third one where on the later stage you have a new fundraising with a very, it's a huge amount of money, of capital that is injected to the company. You can allow your founders, sometimes some investors, sometimes some employee, to exercise some secondary, what we call secondary, I don't know is the term in English, so get some cash for part of the equities they've got. It's not so often, but sometimes that's something that can happen.
Okay, and what's the difference between primary and secondary? Dominic, he said secondary is when investors buybacks, so purchase the shares from the employee. That happens for any kind of startup, and what the different also liquidity events, just like you say, Rodolphe, and how long does it take?
Yeah, I think Rodolphe summarized very well those three things. Look, the time scale can be so variable. Obviously, you have startups sometimes that might be acqui-hired after a year or two, or others that might have a trade sale, after 3, 4, 5 years time. It varies a lot. If you're, I always feel funny saying this, but because Index has had like 25 multi-billion-dollar exits, I can get quite blasé about talking about billion-dollar exits, but the time to get to a billion-dollar plus exit is usually 10 years or so, right, from founding to exit. So it's a very, very long time. In that period, if you're sort of growing, as Rodolphe said, I don't know how familiar people are, but the basic stages of funding: angel seed, Series A, Series B, Series C, and the different points at which that is. For secondary sales, so the only way to have a liquidity event before the IPO or a trade sale is in a secondary sale. And it's very rare before a Series B. I think the stats, I'll give rough stats. I'd say Series B, you might have 20% of Series B might have some secondary in them. a lot of Series Cs and afterwards if you're a successful company. So you only get those secondary sales if you've got excess investor demand. So if you're trying to raise new capital for your company, maybe at Series B, you're trying to raise 25 million euros of new capital. And then investors, you've got a really exciting company, and the investors' term sheets, you've got several of them, and basically investors, you've got 3 or 4 investors saying, oh, we'd love to put money in. At that point, you might be able to say, well, we don't need that much capital. You know, it's great, you're offering it. We don't need that much capital. But if you want to have some ownership of the company, you can buy some of the existing shares, and often those might often be from the angel investors, from early investors in the company who want to sell out, that they want to actually have some liquidity, or it can come from the founders or from employees. So you can have that, but investors won't pay the same amount of money for the for existing equity as they will for putting fresh capital in. There's usually maybe about a 20% discount for various reasons, but that's the standard. Like if you have secondary sale, it would usually be a 20% discount to what the new capital is at. And our basic guideline, if you're talking about this in relation to stock options, is that our rule, again, it's this thing where we don't enforce it, but it's a red flag or a yellow flag for us on founders, is saying if founders want to take out some secondary in that situation, that can be really good and very positive. What we don't like is if you have founders who say, well, I want to take money out of the company, but I'm not going to let any of my employees take money out. We feel like
generous. That's generous.
That's
good.
Misalignment.
That's good.
We sort of feel like, well, if you're going to do it for yourself, you should offer that to your early employees as well.
And how they should do that? They should like do a plan to give some cash outs and to allow people to sell their shares, depending on maybe the seniority,
I think like length or so. You might say anybody who is fully vested on their first grants can trade in maybe up to. You probably have to put a limit because you don't want people becoming millionaires and then deciding I'm going to go sailing around the world for 5 years and leaving the company. Again, it's the retention thing. But you might say you allow employees who are fully vested to cash in something up to either 25% of their total stock options and or maybe 100,000 euros maximum that they could see. And we feel that when you're in a position that you can offer that, you know, they're saying this means you've been a super successful company already, but you're so successful, you're aiming for IPO, which might be another 5 years away. So we feel this is really positive when you can do that, because then even though from our perspective as investors, you're saying, well, you're reducing the retention benefit for those people, they might decide to leave. The bonus is that it's so difficult for employees and people to understand that stock options can be real money. And if you have a few people in the company who are able to trade in early and make some serious, good amounts of money, it makes it real for everybody else. You can celebrate that. You can say, look, we've already had some employees in the company who've made some really good amounts of money and they've been able to, go on some fantastic holidays or pay off a mortgage. That's a really strong message which motivates everybody else. So we're in favor of that. If you are in the fortunate position.
French VC should think just like you do. That's true. And Florian, you've been working for more than 7 years at Box, a really successful company, and so you've seen all the journey from the beginning until the IPO, because they did an IPO with a valuation of $2+ billion. So could you just tell us your story about that?
So we talk about everything from the beginning, the grant, the refresher. Then what happens is a liquidity event at Box. So we went public, an IPO. Very interesting process. Actually, it's very long and painful for a company to organize this.
How long does it take?
Like about a year.
A year?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's very distracting as well from all the other stuff. And you're good actually as execs if you are able to do all the preparation for the IPO while not distracting the teams. And also a big point is to make everyone understand that the IPO is not the finish line. It's not finished at the IPO. It's just one more financing event like the rest, and the journey continue. And actually at Box, they did a great job with this. They put like a lot of posters everywhere with the valuation of all the big companies, Amazon and Netflix, stuff like this, with their valuation at IPO and their valuation like 5 years later. And it's incredible. It's like 50 to 200 times more valuation 5 years later. So you really understand that IPO is just the beginning. Then for us, what it meant as an employee.
After 10 years?
Yeah, I don't know if you know. Yeah, it's still a day one. It's we say pretty often to tell. Entrepreneurship is always about thinking you are at the beginning, otherwise you're dead. So then, as an employee, what happens when you go public is that you will be able to sell your shares on the public market, but you're blocked, and it really sucks actually for 6 months after the IPO.
Why that?
What?
Why you cannot sell your shares?
I don't know. It's
regulations.
Yeah, it's for historical regulations so that you don't have insider information that you can use to sell or buy more. I think there are some good reasons, but then the effects are pretty bad for you. And for example, at Box, the price was $24 for a share at the IPO, but during the 6 months, like it went down to $10. So I was like, okay, fuck guys, like why cannot just sell on the first day? And then it took like a few years to come back to the same level. So you're blocked for 6 years, and then every quarter you have the public announcement of the finance of the company. It's called the quarterly earning call. Then for a few days you cannot trade if you're still inside the company. It's still to protect against insider trading. Yeah, and then you can do whatever you want. You can sell, and then the difficult thing is you can be attached emotionally to your stock and saying, no, I want to keep it forever. It's the best company in the world. But at some point, you have to diversify and buy some other stock and stuff, and it feels weird. Say, no, I want to keep it forever.
This is part of your ownership, and it's like your baby. It's just you don't want like.
Yeah. And today, I still think that Box is completely undervalued to go to what it should be.
You're really loyal.
I'm very loyal. Yes.
Yeah.
Que la famille.